Welcome. I'm Kelly Dewar, Senior Shelter Solutions Specialist at Maddie's Fund. Maddie's insights are practical tips based on current research to help pets and people and that you can use in your shelter. Today, we're joined by Lauren Loney, a licensed attorney, researcher, and advocate with more than 8 years of experience crafting policies and lobbying on a variety of issues at local, state, and federal levels. Lawrence will be addressing the impact of restrictive pet policies in rental housing on pets, animal shelters, and the tenants who love them. She'll introduce us to several programmatic tools that may be most useful to mitigate the flow of these pets into animal shelters. So let's welcome her to learn more.
Hi, Kelly. Thank you so much. And thanks to Maddie's for having me on today. I'm really excited to be here. Let me just share my screen. As Kelly mentioned, my name is Lauren Loney. I am an attorney and I've worked in several different roles in the nonprofit space in animal welfare, but I'm currently doing my pets and housing related advocacy and research under the auspices of a government relations and public policy consulting firm that I founded a couple of years ago. And I'm really excited to share with y'all some of the insights that we have from 3 studies on the consequences of the affordable housing crisis that we're in today and how that's impacting people, pets, and our animal sheltering resources. So typically in my talks on this topic, I like to provide a fair amount of background information about what the affordable housing crisis looks like in the US, and really importantly, how we got here and who is most impacted by this crisis. But for the sake of time today, because I have a lot of research I want to review, I'm keeping this part of the conversation really short. And so I would Allison or the Maddie's team are going to drop a couple of links to National Low Income Housing Coalition resources related to wage gaps, related to the housing crisis, and what this looks like in communities and states across the country. And I would really encourage folks to take a look at these reports. They're really accessible, chock full of information, and I think will be a great supplement to what I am going to cover today. So, at a really high level, we have been in a severe affordable housing crisis in our country for decades. And today, we don't have a single state in the country that has enough affordable and available housing to house our extremely low income renter households. These are households that make 30% or less of area median income, which is like the middle of the road income in your metropolitan or geographic area, or folks who are living at or below the poverty line. So you can see that on this map on the left, where I'm from, Texas, is a red state, meaning that it has 30 or fewer affordable and available rental homes for every 100 extremely low income households. And so you can see that even though there are some states that are doing better than others, no state is adequately providing this housing. And this is really notable because if you look back to the 1970s, before we lost a lot of the federal funding for housing, particularly low income housing, before we had these really, really severe wage gaps between renter wages and the cost of rent. In the 1970s, we had a modest surplus of affordable and available rental homes for all of our extremely low income households. So what we're seeing is the consequences of a decades long shift in disinvesting in housing. And the US Census Bureau reported this year an all-time high of renter households that were experiencing housing cost burden. That means these households are spending at least 30% of their total monthly income on housing related costs. And again, that is a higher percentage of renter households housing cost burden than we have seen to date. Such is the impact of housing on our lives that your zip code, Harvard released a report in 2014 saying that your zip code is a better predictor of your health outcomes than your genetic code. Where you live dictates essentially your access to every single other resource that you need to live a healthy and long life as a person and to be able to care for your pets. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So we know from the American Pet Products Association that an estimated approximately 3/4 of renter households have pets. And if we do the math, we have estimated that just under 20 million pets live with families who are experiencing high levels of housing insecurity. That means these are families who are perhaps one emergency away from not being able to pay rent and are experiencing fear or threat of eviction and losing their home on a fairly consistent basis. Our research and research dating back to the 90s and anecdotally, we hear that housing is often cited as one of the top reasons for owner surrender for pet relinquishment. And the Human Animal Support Services released data earlier this year showing that there are inequitable intakes into animal shelters from more socially vulnerable communities. And I'm sure that that's what so many of you who are working on the ground are seeing, right? That it's lower income people who are struggling to access resources, who are relinquishing more than higher income, less vulnerable households. And the data from Human Animal Support Services pilot shelters bears out. And you can see that in that chart on the left-hand side of that chart, where fully 80% of intakes are from our two most socially vulnerable categories of household as defined by the Social Vulnerability Index. And we know that this social vulnerability, the lack of access to housing, the income issues has compounding problems in that these households lack systemic access to resources for themselves and their pets. And this is so poignantly illustrated by the use of maps. I created this map alongside an organization I used to work for called Texas Housers, which is a fantastic advocacy group based out of Austin, specifically focusing on helping lower income households achieve the goal of finding safe, affordable housing in a high opportunity neighborhood. And we overlaid pet related resources. So those green, blue, and red dots are vet cares, grocery stores that have pet supplies, pet supply stores, grooming, daycare, boarding, are overlaid over a map showing the different levels of poverty by census tract, where the darker gray, the more impoverished that census tract is. And so what you can see here is that a vast majority of resources in the city of Houston, and this is as of 2020, it's a little bit dated, but the pattern is the same across the country. So I would expect this to persist today. So we see a majority of these resources concentrated in areas with very low poverty rates, where the census tracts on the east and southeast sides of the city are complete resource deserts for pets. And this is also where a vast majority of the city of Houston's affordable housing and lower income housing is located, in places where people don't have ready access to the things they need for their pets. So when we dive into the research in this space, it's a growing body of research, which is really, really exciting. But before the last 4 or 5 years, there wasn't a ton of research in this space. So this is just a snapshot of sort of the research articles that have most informed my work so far. Back in the late 90s, we had an article published that found that about 30% of relinquishments were due to housing. That number is cited quite frequently in the advocacy space. Fast forward to 2003, we had the Firepaw study, which is available for free online, that identified some really, really useful bits of information through their survey of landlords. Notably that at that time, about 9% of rental housing was free of significant type or size restrictions in pets, and that renters who needed access to pets allowed housing were paying a 20 to 30% premium in their base rent relative to non-pets allowed housing. So already pet owners, even back in 2003, were being charged more for base rent. Fast forward to 2019 and 2021, a couple of really important pieces of research. Rose et al. Out of University of North Carolina published a study showing the racial and spatial inequalities in pets allowed housing in one county in North Carolina, where they found that neighborhoods that were majority Black households had statistically fewer options for pets allowed housing than neighborhoods where the households were majority white, and that those restrictions tended to be greater in in neighborhoods where the majority of the residents were non-white. So really, really important for us as we're thinking about who is impacted most by pet restrictive housing. And then in 2021, we have the fantastic first edition of the Michelson Found Animals Pi-Hi report that found, importantly, that only about 8% of rental housing in that study was free of significant restrictions. And I just want to point out that from 2003 to 2021, we saw from these two studies, no real improvement in this percentage of really pet inclusive rental housing. So diving into the first of the three studies that we participated in 2021, my research cohort and I published this article looking at the patterns in the use of pet-related fees in Texas, 20 cities in Texas, and how these fees were creating additional cost burdens for renters. So earlier when I was talking about housing cost burden, that's the amount of money that tenants are spending on rent, utilities, and insurance. So how is this pet rent and these non-refundable fees, how is this increasing that burden for renters? And are there differences by income and race in how these fees are applied? So a couple of major findings. We found in our study that the burden of pet fees disproportionately impacted residents in census tracts that had higher populations of Latinx individuals. And we found that higher income census tracts with more expensive properties were actually less likely to charge separate fees for pets. So lower income households were more likely to experience additional fees than were higher income households. In 2024, we published two studies, the first of which was a really high-level look at more than 1 million intake records from 21 human animal support services pilot shelters. We had their intake data from 2019 to 2023, and we looked at this data to try and understand what percentage of total intakes or relinquishments were due to housing. Of the pets that were relinquished due to housing, what were their characteristics? What types of pets were being relinquished? What happened to those pets once they were relinquished? And what were our longitudinal trends over that time frame in relinquishment patterns? So we found in that data that about 14% of intakes were related to housing, and that's pretty consistent with what we're seeing from other organizations. And if you've ever worked with animal shelter data, you know that intake data can be a little bit messy. Data isn't collected very consistently from shelter to shelter. And kudos to everybody in this industry that is working to improve more robust intake programming. I know that that's a major barrier to our ability to understand what's happening in our communities. And I just am in awe of the people who are working really hard to help bring us more consistent intake data. So we had about 50 different subtypes related to housing when we first got this data set. And we bucketed those 50 subtypes into 5 primary housing related subtypes that you can see in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. So we found that a little more than half of pets relinquished due to housing in that data set were dogs. Interestingly, more than a third were cats. I think that's a bit higher than maybe we had anticipated from our anecdotal understanding of what types of pets are most impacted by housing. Because of this data set, we did have a little bit more than half of our intake reasons were due to this unspecified housing or moving. About a third were due to pet-specific restrictions, and just over 8% were due to landlord-related conflict. We found a really strong bimodal distribution in weight among dogs relinquished due to housing issues, with peaks at 11 pounds and 55 pounds. And that while, yes, large dogs did make up the largest percentage of those relinquished due to housing, small dogs were right behind them at 19%, which again is a little bit different than what we tend to think of as pets who are most impacted by housing. When we looked at data across time, we found a couple, and by species, we found a couple of interesting trends. So first, I know this graph is a little bit busy, but the red arrow is pointing to showing a slope showing that numbers of cats were being relinquished in a higher rate over time, whereas all dogs were being relinquished at a lower rate over time in this data set, with large dogs being relinquished at a lower rate than other sizes of dogs. We also looked at longitudinal trends based on housing subtype. Really startlingly, and I think concerningly, we found that number of intakes due to loss of home was actually on the rise sharply over our data set. And perhaps in a positive twist, number of intakes due to those pet-specific restrictions were declining over time. And I think that this might show that our broader issues related to housing insecurity and how many renters are experiencing this housing insecurity is having an increasing impact on our animal shelters since COVID. When we looked at outcomes, we found that 95% of animals relinquished in this data set due to housing had a live outcome, which is great. And pets relinquished by unhoused owners and pit bull type dogs were less likely to have a live outcome than were other types of dogs. And I think that there's perhaps the pit bull type dogs result is not surprising given what we know about euthanasia rates. But I think that the fact that pets relinquished by unhoused owners were less likely to have a live outcome should really be pinging some of our work in the programmatic space about how we're working specifically to keep unhoused owners with their pets. And then another programmatic implication, our house pilot shelters did a really great job of using their very traditional, the sort of traditional outcome pathways. A vast majority of these pets were either adopted or transferred out of the shelter. And only 4% of these pets were returned to their owner over this time frame. And I think we know from existing research, from some of that older research that I referenced earlier, that housing-related relinquishment is known to be the greatest reason for involuntary relinquishment, meaning that people don't really want to be giving up their pets. So this particular category of pet might be a really good focus area for increasing the use of those RTO support services programming, which I know so many shelters are already doing. And I think this data supports expanding that work. On the policy side of things, this data, in my mind, supports a much broader focus in our policy advocacy, which has historically focused on breed, weight, and size related restrictions, with some focus on the fee piece. But the fact that cats and small dogs made up a large proportion of pets that were relinquished really indicates that I think we need to also be focusing on removing arbitrary limits to the number of pets allowed in rental housing. There is some research to suggest that cat owners and small dog owners are more likely to be impacted by those types of policies because they're more likely to have more than one or two pets. And most local laws have health and safety codes governing the number of pets you can have on your property, depending on the property size. And we take a position that there's really no reason for rental housing to be more strict than what the local government is already requiring. And then again, the fact that we're seeing this increase in relinquishment over time due to loss of home really indicates to me that our advocacy should be very focused in affordability issues and broader housing advocacy related to access to housing and tenants' rights. So a really big focus on disallowing the use of unjustifiable non-refundable fees and pet rents. The last study that I want to talk about today is our most recent paper. It was published in October, end of October of this year. Huge shout out to the ASPCA for this study, who funded our open access funds for this paper. So it is available to read for free for anybody who is interested. I worked on this research in conjunction with University of Denver's Institute for Human-Animal Connection. It was a qualitative study where IHAC researchers conducted in-depth interviews with 25 tenants who were living at the time in subsidized housing in Houston. And I won't go too deep into the methods for how we did recruitment, but at the time I was the Texas State Director for the Humane Society of the United States and still had robust connections in the tenants' rights world from my previous work. And so we worked with my former employer, Texas Housers, Houston Tenants Union, and our Houston-based, some of our Houston-based animal welfare partners to recruit tenants who either wanted to have a pet but couldn't, had a pet in affordable housing, or had to give their pet up in order to access housing. So today I'm going to share a few of the themes that came out of these interviews and the tenant responses and how they are impacting our policy recommendations. So a lot of tenants in this study expressed, of course, the importance of finding housing that allowed them to bring their pet. This tenant said, quote, "When I left my dog behind, that was a heartbreaking thing. I had to choose if I had to leave him or I had to go out. It's like choosing between life and death." And I think that that is a really, really important thing for us to remember, that on the flip side, so when people are being forced to give up their pets, we know now that this is most often not some rash decision, but a really, really difficult, I wouldn't even call it a choice, right? It's either your pet or a roof over your head. Tenants expressed they were noticing that in subsidized affordable housing in Houston, there was a strong preference for small dogs, and often this type of housing wouldn't allow certain breeds. So this tenant discussed their experience with trying to find subsidized housing and tenant with a pit bull and a dog larger than 30 pounds. So this really highlights for us that we can't leave affordable housing out of our conversation whenever we're talking about breed, weight, and size. Our tenants pretty consistently, our participants pretty consistently discuss their limited options for housing in general, which of course goes back to the big picture data that I showed at the beginning. This participant was on a wait list for housing for 6 years before they were able to get into their current home at that time. And they said, quote, "When I got a call to move in here, this was like the only option I had." And it's really important to note that this is not an anomaly. Tenants using housing choice vouchers, which are these tenants vouchers that they can take to get into market rate housing, have a median wait time of 1.5 years, with the more than 25% of tenant voucher providers have wait times for those vouchers of at least 3 years. It's less extreme, but still really bad in the public housing space, where the median wait time to get into public housing is 9 months. So if you're working with clients on the ground, you probably have, and folks who are particularly housing insecure, you've probably worked with a client who has been sleeping in their car, who has been sleeping on their friend's couch, who has been couch surfing while they're waiting to get access to housing they can afford. And when those people have pets, it makes not only that wait time more challenging, but it significantly reduces their choices for housing once they do get that voucher. Several other participants discussed the added challenges of having records like eviction records or criminal backgrounds. This tenant highlights a really significant issue with common tenant screening provisions that make you identify if you have, for example, a felony on your record. They said, for me, it's really more about my background that stresses me. That, I don't care how long and how far back it is, there's still that box, and that's discrimination too. Tenants consistently mentioned the affordability consequences that if you have enough money, you can get a pet. This tenant at the bottom said it really clearly. I would love to have a dog, but only if the pet fees were not so high. And then these last two things I want to share, I think, are really important for informing our advocacy in this particular subset of housing. Tenants noted a lack of clear and upfront communication of pet policies by apartment complexes. So this tenant was approved at their rental housing, but when they brought their dog in, the property manager says, oh, you can move in, but you got to get rid of your pit bull before you can get that housing. So that's after she had gone through, or they had gone through the entire approval process for getting into that housing to begin with. And then there was a really strong desire for affordable housing that was more designed with pets in mind. This tenant said, I feel like they don't give an area for the owner to have peace of mind while walking their dog. So this research did highlight some similar trends for recommendations in the policy space: breed, weight, and size restrictions, addressing fee issues, ensuring that affordable housing allows pets as a basis. But I had the opportunity to work with the tenants to co-create these policy recommendations, and these are three different and really important policy recommendations that I hope we can start to implement on the local level in the next year. So requiring written and consistent pet policies at each subsidized housing property and making sure that those policies are easily accessible to potential tenants. And then finally, engaging in the public processes that we all have the opportunity to engage in around influencing where affordable housing is built and working to make sure that it's built in areas of deconcentrated poverty, close to green spaces, and for all pet owners, not just dog owners, within reasonable distance of stores and services for the supplies and services they need for their pets. And this goes back to that map I showed you of Houston, right? Where all of those areas of concentrated poverty, which is where the affordable housing in Houston is cited, were in complete resource deserts. So in sort of conclusion of this, how this research has influenced my evolving definition of pet inclusive housing. If we want to address relinquishment due to housing, so we want to mitigate the flow of these more socially vulnerable, flow of pets coming from these more socially vulnerable households, we really need equitable access to pet inclusive housing. And that's kind of a different thing than just advocating for pet inclusive housing in general. So to me, this means equitable access to housing that is sufficient. So sufficient in number, affordable to pet keeping families, regardless of their income, located in a high opportunity neighborhood, free of major breed, weight, size, and number restrictions, and not including those non-refundable fees that exacerbate affordability issues. Now, this is pretty aspirational, I know, but I think that there are really tangible ways that we can start to take chunks out of this issue. And the really incredible thing is that a lot of the things a lot of the policy work that I think we as animal welfare need to shift our focus to are already being advocated on by our affordable housing and tenants' rights cohort of organizations that we've typically been siloed from, but there's a growing need for us to unsilo our work programmatically and in a policy space so that we're working together and supporting each other's initiatives. So the four kind of buckets of very tangible types of policies that I would encourage everybody to think about and to reach out to their local housing advocacy networks to talk about and to see what they're working on. Starts with policies addressing systemic racial inequity in access to housing in general, and affordable housing more specifically, and more specifically, pet inclusive affordable housing. So these are just examples of 3 pieces of legislation that I have advocated on since joining the animal welfare movement, or have at least followed. So prohibiting source of income discrimination means that tenants who have housing choice vouchers should get to take their voucher into a neighborhood that's high opportunity and use their tenant in market rate housing in a neighborhood of their choice. In some states, like where I come from in Texas, it's legal for landlords to discriminate against housing choice voucher holders. And that's keeping lower income people who need assistance out of well-resourced neighborhoods and out of neighborhoods where they are less likely to face really strict pet-related restrictions. Reparations related policies, specifically in this case, I'm referencing a bill that passed in Washington that provided reparations to Black families who were excluded from subsidized mortgages or access to home ownership due to racially discriminatory redlining and racially restrictive covenants prior to the passage of the Fair Housing Act. This will explicitly serve to close the generational wealth gap between white and Black households, and also will help to close the gap in homeownership rates between those same groups of people. And then finally, increasing funding for programs to make sure that fair housing laws are being adequately enforced. Earlier this week, y'all heard from the amazing folks at Heart LA about emotional support animals and how those fair housing laws are not always adequately enforced. Well, there are sometimes opportunities to push for states to increase funding for that type of enforcement work. And we should be paying attention and advocating in that space alongside them. Housing that's affordable to all income levels in neighborhoods with resources that people and pets need. So this is what I'm talking about, getting involved in state and local opportunities to influence where affordable housing is built and preserved. These are just a few ways to get involved, and I'm happy. I got my start in affordable housing in the low income housing tax credit property space, so the LIHTC, LIHTC, and I'm happy to chat with anybody who has questions about how to understand what your local groups are doing around the development of affordable housing, how we can ensure that those are pet inclusive and that they're built in the neighborhoods that are going to set people up for success. The third big bucket are bills that will fund not only the provision of direct support to current pet owners, to support current pet owners, but also affordable housing funding in general. Our federal government has disinvested in housing by a significant amount since the late 1970s, and groups like National Low Income Housing Coalition are every single session up at Congress demanding that the federal government properly subsidize affordable housing so that we can get back to a place in this country where there is enough affordable and available housing for low-income tenants. And for the former part of that category, all this policy work is really, I'm biased, but I think policy work is really important for systemic change. But y'all know from your work on the ground that you have people who need support right now. And my colleagues who work in the direct support space need funding. And there are occasionally appropriations bills coming down from the state level that would directly support that type of work. And so I definitely encourage you to stay abreast of those types of funding opportunities at your local and state level. And then, of course, continuing with this, are sort of what we all think of when we are working in this space of, written non-discretionary pet policies, eliminating breed, size, weight, and number restrictions. And then I'm going to dive a little bit more before I wrap up into this space around non-refundable pet fees and pet rents. and whether or not those are appropriately categorized as junk fees. So there are a few different definitions of junk fees. Y'all may have seen earlier in the year, the Biden administration, the White House released that they are a big push to eliminate junk fees in lots of different industries, from concert ticket sales to rental housing to credit cards. But there's a few different definitions of junk fees specifically in the rental housing space. A report by University of Texas School of Law, which is my alma mater, defines junk fees as steep fees that far exceed the cost a landlord incurs in providing a service or remedying damage to a property. In DC, it's where I currently live. It's quite a long definition, but I think notably is this language that says fees that are not used for their stated purpose or that add burdens for people who use rental assistance. And so hopefully, as we've already had these conversations, you're kind of like making the connection to the ways in which pet fees may be contemplated as junk fees in some of these cases. And so this is the press release that came out in March from the White House. And so are pet fees junk fees? And the National Consumer Law Center and the University of Texas at Austin have both released reports identifying that pet fees, non-refundable pet fees, may be properly categorized as junk fees and may be properly regulated as such if they are not justifiable, if they exceed the actual costs that landlords are facing, or in the case of DC, if they are adding additional burden to those who use rental assistance. I share this opinion very firmly, and these are my 3 dogs with a little text bubble that says, "Show me the justification." Right now, there is no legal requirement for any landlord to document how they use non-refundable pet rents and upfront fees in the maintenance of their rental housing. And until those fees are properly justified, I believe that we should be regulating these fees as junk fees. And here's a couple of reasons why I think these fees are more properly defined as junk fees and revenue streams for landlords, as opposed to justifiable costs in many situations. I'm sure there are exceptions. So a quick review of websites giving tips for how to maximize rental income. This is one example. You can see that bottom line. Instead of collecting a pet deposit from residents who have pets, which tenants get back if there's no damage, ask them to pay a one-time fee or ongoing pet charge, which that landlord or owner-operator gets to keep, regardless of whether or not there has been any damage caused by a pet. This website was 10 ways to make more money from rental properties. The 4th item was offer additional services and amenities. Take pets, for example. Some property owners refuse to rent to people with pets. This means that pet owners are willing to pay more to have their pets accepted in the lease. And then finally, a website article titled "How Pets Can Drive Revenue." Quote, "The most obvious forms of pet-driven revenue often consist of an upfront, non-refundable pet fee and monthly pet rent." And I share all of this because I think that if we want to, getting back to addressing relinquishment, this affordability piece and the way that pet owners are being charged and charged fees for that exceed the cost to the landlord is a really damaging trend in our rental housing industry. So before I wrap up, I'm not going to go through every bill on this chart. I wanted to provide this chart for y'all so that if you want to take a photo of it, we're also going to be sharing this work, these slides via PDF. So I wanted this all in one place for you guys. But this is just a snapshot, some examples of pet-specific legislation that has been introduced or passed at federal, state, and local levels. And I have them bucketed sort of by category, as you can see on the far left of the graph. Although several of these bills, like Colorado House Bill 1068, for example, are kind of kitchen sink bills where they touch on various pieces of various categories of pet related work. And I have to take a moment to shout out Councilman White from DC, who introduced this DC Pets and Housing Amendment Act, and it just passed our first full city council vote last week, and we're really anxious for the second full city council vote to happen next week in the hopes that we will have regulated pet rent and non-refundable fees and deposits in DC as well. So I'll wrap up with just some ongoing research. I'm really excited in sort of this space where I'm getting to collaborate with a lot of different organizations to be working on a fairly wide range of research around this pets and housing space. So with the Institute for Human Animal Connection out of University of Denver, we're about to launch a research study assessing the effectiveness of pet deposit assistance intervention to increase perceived housing security for tenants with pets and to prevent pet relinquishment beyond that lease term for which the pet deposit was offered. So if anybody on this call has a pet deposit assistance program already up and running, and you're interested in seeing if any of your clients want to participate in these two surveys, please feel free to reach out. We're really excited to be able to put some data behind what we think is a really effective intervention for ensuring that people have longer term stability in housing. I've partnered with CARE to conduct legal research supporting a mass media Know Your Rights campaign for tenants with pets in 4 different cities. So we'll be really excited to roll that project out. And then very excited to work with Colorado State University's Animal Human Policy Center to assess how this pet regulation, when it passes, how it's impacting pets allowed housing in general. So when we're advocating in this space, we're at public hearings, we often hear landlords say, if you pass this bill, we're just not going to allow pets at all in our properties. And what our research is showing preliminarily is that that is not the case. And we believe that the huge percentage of the rental market that is pet owners will prevent some sort of mass exodus from the pet-friendly space in the rental housing arena. I also do all of this work essentially in partnership with my amazing collaborator, Dr. Jenny Applebaum out of University of Florida. So shout out to Jenny. And then this photo, this dog is Cooper, who was our first foster fail in my family, and he passed away a couple of years ago, but he was our first opportunity where we really had to navigate what it was like to find rental housing with an 80-pound dog. So Cooper has been a real inspiration and part of sort of like my own personal story in this space. So lots of love to Koopa Loop there. And with that, thank you so much to Maddie, not only for having me on today, but for being a primary funder for HOS, which allowed us access to that relinquishment data. Society for Companion Animal Studies funded the Houston tenant study. So huge thanks to that organization. And then to the staff at HOS who collaborated a lot on our intake reasons data and all of the other students and funders and participants in our research. So with that, I'll take some questions.
Thank you so much. That was really, really eye-opening and helpful. We have a ton of great questions and some comments too. One is the first one is a comment, these studies are heartbreaking. And that is the truth.
It is. I think that one of the things I think has been really important with this housing work is it's been I think such an eye-opening learning curve for a lot of people that has helped to take some of the judgment out of this space for why people are giving up their pets when housing is the reason. And I just hope that the more people learn, like the more we can approach these situations with compassion and understanding.
Absolutely. We had two questions that were pretty similar, and they're basically, what can we do about the housing problem? Like, how can we help? The town I'm moving to, Jackson, Wyoming, has an affordable housing shortage,
Ah,
and um, yeah,
yeah, Jackson, Wyoming is definitely a difficult place to be if you're looking for affordable housing. So, I think that in addition to just sort of educating, using some of the resources like the National Low Income Housing Coalition to get a big picture understanding of what this crisis is looking like, I always think that the best place to start is a quick Google search of which community-based organizations in your town or your state are focused on housing and get to know them. Join their email list, sign up for their action alerts, go to their meetings, and then you can sort of bring to that conversation this extra information about, well, for people with pets, this pet component is a huge part of the affordable housing crisis for them. So I always say start local. There's lots of great educational tools that are like higher level, but start local. Quick Google, find out who in your community is already doing this work, and figure out how you can plug in.
next one is to just she says, sorry, to remind me, when we're talking about the numbers from the middle study,
Mhm.
where was this study focused, or was it nationwide?
Great question. So those data came from 15 animal shelters across 21 animal shelters across 15 different states. So it was a nationwide-ish study, but not fully representative of shelters across the country. So, but did come from data across multiple states. A lot from California. So I think California was maybe overly represented in that data, but all the way Florida to California.
Thanks. Do you think that the decrease in dog intakes due to housing challenges might also be impacted by the lack of shelter capacity for dogs nationally, especially large dogs? Or
Yeah.
were all the shelters involved in the study open admission shelters that were able to accept every owner surrender in their area?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I think that our data is also compounded by COVID, right? When shelters were empty. So that data covered 2019 to 2023. So most of our shelters remained open intake. Most of the shelters in this study were open intake. There were a few in this data set that were not open intake. But by and large, these were open intake shelters. I do think, though, that is a really um, interesting and important question and caveat to the data. And it would be fascinating to overlay that data with periods of time in which these open intake shelters may be closed or were at capacity, to see how um, the addition of that layer changed the results. So I think that's a really, really important perspective.
All right. Is there a study on owners who leave pets behind in environmental disasters? Why is there no access to a safe place for these families to take their pets in Florida and the East Coast during hurricane season, or the West Coast during fires, um, or middle states during tornadoes?
Yeah, that's so the I don't know. I am almost certain that studies do exist. I can't think of it. I can't point to any of them off the top of my head, but if we could, I can follow up with you with those studies. Um, My Dog is My Home published a study not too long ago looking at climate related immigration, so climate disaster related immigration and how pets are impacted in that space. It's a really incredible study. It's also open access. So that's the one that's coming to the top of my head, but it's not specifically with these domestic natural disasters. Now there has been There have been several pieces of legislation in some states that address this issue. So Colorado has had legislation. I think all the West Coast states, Washington, Oregon, and California have had legislation. This is not my area of expertise, so don't quote me, but there has been legislation at multiple levels of government that where they will require at least one emergency shelter in times of those natural disasters to allow pets. That's also a really great opportunity for local advocacy with your own local response programs. Like every county has like a response system, right, that is activated whenever there is a crisis. And you can advocate with them to work with local animal shelter resources to open up some of those shelters to pets. Things like offering crates, offering leashes, if they need vet care, having somebody on site to help provide vet care. So there's a lot of programmatic opportunities in that space too, aside from just those policy mandates. So I'd say that's a, two-part answer there.
Thank you. This one is um, a good one. Can you provide any insight into how the incoming administration and the administration's expressed priorities related to HUD policies might impact this work?
Yes. I have so many thoughts. I think that outside of COVID, there hasn't been a robust investment in affordable housing at the federal level from either party. So already the 2025 proposed budget by the current administration is reduced relative to 2024. So I think that a political party that has a strong desire to reduce expenditures is definitely, I think, a threat to an already bare bones HUD programming. As I understand it, in the affordable housing space more broadly, there's going to be a sizable focus on the low-income housing tax credit program in 2025. So HUD is one provider of affordable housing with more like typical housing choice vouchers, project-based Section 8, public housing. But the IRS actually governs the low-income housing tax credit program, which is the largest supplier of funding for affordable housing and development and preservation. So I think that there will be a shift in efforts to focus on LIHTC reform specifically so that that funding targets extremely low income households. But in terms of federal policies outside of that, so I guess I think that the primary issue here is HUD going to lose even more funding? And so that's going to impact access to affordable housing across the board. That's where I would be most concerned. But there was also the fantastic effort with the PUP Act this year that probably a lot of folks on this call are familiar with, that would have created a funding stream for human shelters to become pet inclusive. And I think that it didn't pass, it's already a struggle under this administration, and I think may prove to be more of a struggle to gain traction on those kinds of bills in the new administration. But just to clarify, most of my work has been at the state and local levels. So I always think that that's like, even at the federal level, if it becomes less palatable, there's always work at the local and state levels.
Couple of comments. I believe that emotional support animals can also qualify for the animals. They need support just like the humans.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I paid way too many junk fees for my two cats. LOL.
Yes. Yes. That is, and if somebody has an ESA, then they're not subject to breed, weight, or size restrictions or to additional fees. So that's a really important component for especially, lower income tenants with less housing choice.
You just answered the next question. Um, she says, two puppies are a rescue, and I also saved a bunny. Husband and I both found that we supported them in finding love by humans. They need emotional support, especially because they can't speak for themselves. When will an animal need for emotional support be a law, just like these animals do for us?
Yeah, that's I would say that is probably quite a long ways off, although there has been some movement in recognizing like that these are that animals are not just property. They're like property plus in the law. So there have been some examples of laws passed where for example, they have to be considered in like divorce decrees. So where they're treated as more than just this cup, which historically, technically, pets have not had any greater value than their actual economic value. So I would say that's a long way off, but I think that there are people who are really working in that space for sure.
Based on data and or your experience, can legal aid offices assist in tenants with the issues relating to pets?
I think the primary barrier there is resources. So it's not that they can't assist people who meet the income requirements for legal aid with issues related to pets. It's that there are not enough resources to go around. And so I think that's the primary problem. So, there are some examples of that are in eviction cases, landlords are represented by legal counsel approximately 95% of the time. Tenants are represented by legal counsel approximately 4 to 6% of the time. So I also think that it's important to know. So there's just like a whole lack of access to legal counsel for lower income individuals across the board. I also think it's really important to note, and I feel like I keep talking about Heart LA's conversation a lot. Hopefully that's posted so that people can go back and watch it. But one of the points that they made is that you don't have to be an attorney to be an advocate for somebody in this space, right? So often, just being part of the animal welfare movement, being this outside voice saying, "Hey, I know the law. I'm paying attention to what's happening in this situation. I'm here to advocate alongside this tenant so that you kind of help to improve the power dynamic a little bit." So you don't have to be a lawyer to be intervening in these situations. So I think that that's an important component of this work as well.
Our shelter is considering offering good neighbor workshops to pet guardians so property managers know that tenants have been supported in addressing unwanted pet behaviors. Do you know of any organizations that are already doing something similar?
That's a really good question and a whole facet of this work that I didn't even touch on. So with those sorts of questions around like how do we work with landlords to make this a more what's the right word, like to improve the dynamic around pets in rental housing. Michelson Found Animals Pie High content has so much great work around how to start those types of programs in your own community, and what types of things you can do to facilitate those conversations with landlords. So I always like to point to the Pie High resources for that type of work.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lauren, and thanks to all of you watching today's webcast. Lauren will be available on Maddie's Pet Forum to continue this discussion and answer your questions. There's at least one here that we will move on to there right now. So thank you all, and we will see you next time. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, y'all. Appreciate your time.